Hi everyone, it's meteorologist Brian Bennett. I'm going to quickly go over the details and the impacts you can expect from Nicole as it moves onshore Wednesday night. How strong will the winds be? How heavy will the rain be? How large will the waves be? Will storm surge be an impact in your area? And yes, it is going to be an impact on the east coast and the west coast of Florida, and also red tide. I doubt many folks are talking about red tide, but this storm is going to have an impact on red tide as well. So I'll share all that with you as quickly as I can over the next couple of minutes. Looking at the satellite imagery, you can see the storm is firing up a little bit, trying to develop an inner eye wall right around the center of circulation. It is perhaps entraining a little bit of dry air, which could be limiting some of the development, but nonetheless, it does look like a fairly healthy storm. You can see the Bahamas located right here, and the east coast of Florida located here. The storm is moving towards the west, perhaps a little bit of a northwesterly component to it as well. But it will move onshore Wednesday night, and it will have maximum sustained winds when it moves onshore between 65 and 75 miles per hour, which means it'll be right on that threshold between a strong tropical storm or a very low-end Cat 1 hurricane. So the winds will not be anything compared to what they were with Ian, but nonetheless, this storm will have a wide impact because it is a massive storm, and it will be disruptive, and it could bring power outages, etc., especially to the east coast of Florida, and there is that storm surge risk as well. So let's take a look at some of the details here. Here's the National Hurricane Center track, and you can see, first of all, how big this storm is. The yellow color here representing where the tropical storm force winds are located, and from one point to the other point that's bigger than the state of Florida. And if you've ever driven from Miami to Jacksonville, you know that's pretty big. So we're looking at a wide swath of tropical storm force winds, and all that is blowing towards the shore. That's why we're looking at these huge waves and that storm surge risk as well, and then possibly even a storm surge risk on the west coast of Florida once we get those winds rotating counterclockwise and coming in off the water, which will happen during the latter part of the storm. Here's a look at the high-resolution rapid refresh model, the very latest one, and this is our future radar here. So let's go into the future, and you can see, let's stop here first into Wednesday morning, and you can see Wednesday morning the storm is still offshore. We are seeing some of the outer rain bands starting to move from north to south over the Florida Peninsula, but not really too much of a concern Wednesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, some of those rain bands start to pick up a little bit, but the strong winds and the very heavy rain still located offshore. But again, some pockets of heavier downpours moving from north to south across the Florida Peninsula by Wednesday afternoon. And then Wednesday night is when things really start to pick up in earnest, especially on the east coast of Florida. The west coast of Florida, Wednesday evening, still pretty quiet, but the east coast seeing very heavy rain as the storm moves onshore, and those winds will be picking up as that center of circulation approaches as well. And then let's pause it right about here. This is right around 11 p.m. Wednesday evening, or perhaps even midnight, and you can see the center of circulation right here moving onshore between Cape Canaveral and northern West Palm Beach area. So the storm will move onshore right here on the eastern half of the peninsula, and then it'll move off to the west-northwest, possibly scraping the Big Bend area. So fast forwarding, so by Wednesday night, we're looking at heavy rain occurring throughout much of Tampa Bay, and the heaviest rain will move into the Gulf of Mexico and start to exit the Tampa area by late Thursday morning, other than perhaps a few trailing rain bands, which are possible as well. Now, this model does have the center of circulation moving back out into the Gulf of Mexico. I do question whether that's going to happen or whether it'll just ride right up the coast of the Big Bend area. I think it'll perhaps move a little bit farther east than what the model has it doing right here. So it'll probably move, again, right up the Big Bend once it moves farther north. Some of these outer rain bands, as the storm exits, we'll have to watch as well. They tend to train over one location, and they could drop quite a bit of rain if they were to continue to fall over one spot. Those are hard to forecast, but just know that could be a possibility even after it looks like the storm is kind of moving out of here. So again, here goes the storm. It moves on shore Wednesday night and into Thursday morning. That heavy rain spreading fairly quickly across the state of Florida, and then here we are by Thursday late afternoon. You can see the storm is exiting as far as the rain goes, but we'll still be feeling the wind impacts and even an increasing storm surge risk as we move into Thursday morning and Thursday afternoon for the west coast of Florida. All right, let's look at the future cast. How much rain are we talking about? A fair amount of rain, but not a complete deluge. Let's take the model all the way out through the end of the forecast period, and you can see here for the east coast of Florida, the white color representing 4 to 5 inches of rain, so maybe close to half a foot of rain, and some of the heavier repeated downpours that occur through the middle half of the state and over towards the eastern Atlantic coast. Over in western Tampa Bay, we could see the possibility, on average, for 1 to 3 inches of rain. So decent rainfall, considering November is typically one of our drier months. Also, I want to mention, too, how unusual this storm is for it to be moving almost due west in November and make landfall on the east coast of Florida. That just doesn't happen in November. Those cold fronts and the jet stream come whipping down and force those storms to turn to the northeast. That is not the case with the storm. It is being allowed to move due west straight into Florida. So here we are in November, and even though hurricane season ends in about 22 days, we're still experiencing tropical weather. Yes. All right, so here's a look at the wind forecast, and I'll talk about the wind direction in a minute, which will be very important. But right now, I just want to talk about the magnitude. And here we are Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning, the winds will be blowing at the immediate coastline of the east coast of Florida in the greenish color here, which will be a sustained wind of right around 25 to 30 miles per hour. That wind will decrease as you head inland. You get the friction of the land, the trees, the houses, the buildings, and all that will block the wind quite a bit. But again, really windy from the coast of Georgia all the way down through much of the eastern half of the peninsula of Florida as well. A little breezy across Tampa Bay and down through southwest Florida, but not anything damaging during the Wednesday morning hours. Wednesday afternoon, the winds start to pick up across the entire peninsula. Here we are Wednesday evening. The winds along the immediate eastern coast around, let's say, Cape Canaveral down to northern West Palm Beach are blowing right around 40 miles per hour sustained, possibly gusting around 60 miles per hour. So very windy along the immediate coastline, but nothing too concerning occurring for the middle half of the state or Tampa Bay for that matter either. Fast forward through the middle of the night. Here we are the middle of the night, Wednesday night and into Thursday morning, and you can see we are looking at winds that have been occurring on the east coast of Florida between Cape Canaveral and northern West Palm Beach, between the red color here representing about 58 knots, so let's say about 65 miles per hour sustained, possibly gusting as high as 75, maybe an 80 mile per hour gust at the immediate coastline. Also keeping in mind that NASA has a $4 billion rocket parked outside the Artemis launch that we're expecting to happen hopefully after the storm has passed, but nonetheless that $4 billion rocket is sitting outside and will hopefully not be impacted by this tropical system. Anyway, the storm's going to move off to the west-northwest. Here we are. First of all, let me show you this here. The strongest winds for the spine of Florida will be occurring right around 1 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday night and Thursday morning. And up and down the spine of the state, the winds will be peaking out right around 40 to perhaps 50 miles per hour sustained, maybe a gust a little bit higher. That'll be enough to maybe bring down a tree branch or two, or maybe even a loosely rooted tree in the middle half of the state. But that'll kind of be it as far as the maximum winds up and down the spine of the state. Again, going back to the landfall, the winds will be much stronger along the immediate coastline. That could be approaching sustained hurricane force winds at the area beaches, anywhere from Jacksonville, Cape Canaveral, all the way down to northern West Palm Beach. Winds will not be as strong down in parts of Miami, Homestead, and even down in the Keys areas as the storm will be moving farther north. The storm progresses off to the west-northwest. Here we are Thursday morning, and the maximum winds with the storm may actually not happen for Tampa Bay in the western half of the storm. They may happen once the storm moves right offshore, perhaps right along the Big Bend. Once those winds turn westerly is when area beaches will actually see the very strongest winds. So winds will be blowing at the immediate coastlines of, let's say, Anna Maria Island up through Pinellas County, Citrus, Hernando, Pasco counties, up through the Big Bend. Winds will be blowing at the beach sustained right around 45, 50 miles per hour, maybe a wind gust upwards of 65 or so miles per hour at area beaches, and then decreasing fairly rapidly as you move on shore and get away from again, you gain that friction from the trees and the buildings, etc. Nonetheless, Tampa, with those winds blowing out of the southwest, could see winds blowing close to 45, 50 miles per hour and some of the stronger rain bands as the wind comes off the bay fairly unimpeded. And then the storm moves off to the north. It won't move over the Gulf long enough, even if it does move just west of the Big Bend area, to regain any strength, so not really too concerned about the panhandle as far as storm surge or even intensity from wind goes. Just kind of windy and maybe a bit of rain as well for the panhandle. All right, that is the wind intensity. Quickly looking at the waves, we're going to look at some big waves happening, and the pinkish color here, purple color, represents waves that are right around 45 feet, and most of this is offshore of the east coast of Florida, but some of these bigger waves will migrate to the coast from Jacksonville all the way down to West Palm Beach. We'll see very large waves. If you're a surfer and you just can't resist it and you're going to go out in this, please be very careful. We're looking at a very high likelihood of rip currents occurring, and there really won't be anybody to go out and help you in the event that you do have a problem. So really it's best to stay out of area waters, as the storm will have massive surf, something we're not typically seeing on the coast of Florida, and also lots of beach erosion as well. A lot of that contributes to the size of this storm as well. We're looking at some big waves happening in the Gulf of Mexico, right around 20 feet waves offshore possible. Not as big as what's happening on the east coast of Florida, because the winds will be blowing onshore for a much longer time period on the east coast of Florida. But nonetheless, large surf. Everybody should be staying away from their boats. Those boats should be docked in a safe place, whether you're on the east coast or the Gulf Coast of Florida, as we are looking again at some very large surf. Here's kind of a quick and dirty look at the storm surge possibility from the National Hurricane Center. Roughly 2 to 4 feet storm surge possible for coastal Carolinas, down through Georgia, the Georgia Bight, down through much of the peninsula of Florida, and then you get down towards Miami, and Miami kind of tucks in a little bit, so we're not looking at much of a storm surge in the Miami area. Tampa Bay, that includes the actual bay itself in Pinellas County, down through parts of Bradenton Beach, Anna Maria. Could see 1 to 3 foot storm surge. Head farther north towards Cedar Key in the areas that typically see a little bit greater surge, and we're looking at a 2 to 4 foot storm surge. A lot of that depends on the wind direction. Let me change this back to the ZRZ model run, and the wind direction is everything. So that's going to control who's getting the storm surge, and it's also going to control what's happening with red tide as well. So let's quickly talk about the wind direction so you can know when storm surge might be a concern in your area. Basically, it's a concern when the winds are blowing onshore. So here we are Wednesday morning. The winds will be blowing onshore on the east coast of Florida. They'll be blowing offshore on the west coast of Florida. So we actually may have a little bit of a negative surge on the west coast of Florida Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, as those winds blow out of the northeast and kind of blow the water out into the Gulf. On the other hand, they are blowing it against the coast of the east coast of Florida. So onshore winds for the east coast of Florida Wednesday morning, Wednesday afternoon, those onshore winds become stronger. Here we are Wednesday evening, very strong onshore winds. Strong relative to the tropical storm / low-end Cat 1 hurricane. So we're looking at those onshore winds possibly bringing storm surge to parts of, again, anywhere from northern West Palm Beach all the way up through Cape Canaveral, up through Jacksonville area. Still primarily an offshore wind for Wednesday evening. Wednesday night, things change. Now we're still looking at an onshore wind for areas basically about Jupiter and areas north on the east coast, but then a big thing happens for the Gulf Coast of Florida. We start to see those winds turn westerly, which that's then going to allow the possibility for a bit of a storm surge to occur. So here we are Thursday morning. This is right around 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, and notice those winds turning westerly on the bottom half of the storm. So we're starting to think, okay, the rain is starting to calm down. Things could be chilling out a little bit, but that's actually when the storm surge risk is going to arise for the Tampa Bay area. That's also when red tide, which is looming offshore of Sanibel and Manatee and Sarasota counties, is going to be blowing against the shore, bringing those dead fish and the the respiratory issues associated with red tide onshore. And that onshore wind is going to continue for the Gulf Coast of Florida all the way through Thursday night, and even into Friday morning as well. All right, let's take a look at this map here. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because this is something that you can look at on the National Hurricane Center webpage. It's a fantastic graphic that shows you storm surge inundation possible. Inundation shows you how much water will be onshore in an area that is typically dry. So basically, if you were to walk out on the beach in, let's say Boynton Beach here, if you were to walk out on the beach on an average day and then raise the water by the blue color here represents 1 foot above ground level. So that means that that water would raise 1 foot and be 1 foot higher than it would typically be on land that would typically be dry. So 1 foot inundation for Palm Beach, and then you notice once you get up to the part of Florida where it starts to curve back westward, you're starting to get buffeted by those northeast winds a bit more. So basically, northern West Palm Beach, we're starting to see some yellows here. That represents roughly 3 foot inundation, so 3 feet of water in an area that's typically dry. I'm thinking that that will not be enough of a storm surge to exceed the dunes that are on the beach, so it should not pass the dunes and come on to actual beach parking lots in most areas, but it could bring the water a little too close to that threshold than we would desire for much of the east coast of Florida. We're looking all the way up through Fort Pierce. This really continues all the way up through the Jacksonville area with that 3 foot inundation possible. And you know, if you're in an area that typically sees a little bit more of a storm surge risk, then you want to definitely heed caution as we're looking at those onshore winds bringing inundation to the east coast of Florida, but also the west coast as well. Here's a look at the forecast here for the west coast of Florida. Again, this would be when the storm is actually starting to wind down on Thursday, but we can see Anna Maria Island, for example, is looking at some areas that could be experiencing a little bit of flooding, especially if this happens. If the stronger winds happen with high tide, we have the near full moon, so that means higher tides than usual. So we get a high tide combined with those onshore winds from the west, and we could be looking at some storm surge flooding. So actually, storm surge flooding is a greater risk for much of Tampa Bay with this storm than it was with Ian, because Ian moved onshore down towards Fort Myers, and we got that negative surge. With this, however, on the back end, we're going to get those onshore winds that could bring a bit of a storm surge concern to some areas. Take a look at Pascagoula up here. We know the Pascagoula area near the Don Cesar always floods every time there's a tropical system, and it looks like we'll have about 1 foot inundation in that area right around the Don Cesar. Beach area is looking at about 3 foot inundation from much of Pinellas County, and again, I don't think it'll surpass the dunes. I think the water will stay in the beach areas, but nonetheless, it could be getting a little higher than comfort for many areas along the beach. And that really continues all the way up through Clearwater Beach, and then you get up into the Cedar Key and Big Bend areas, and we're looking at some possible flooding from surge in that area as well. Not massive flooding, but considerable, considering it'll be a tropical storm for sure at this point. This video is getting kind of long, so I want to try to wrap it up as quickly as I can here, and thank you for watching if you're still here. Wanted to quickly talk about red tide. This is the red tide satellite from today. The red color represents high levels likely of red tide from the fluorescence imagery here on the European satellite imagery here. Red color represents where we have likely dead fish due to low oxygen levels and red tide. And we get those westerly onshore winds. What's going to happen? It's going to blow this mess towards the coast. So we've already been looking at dead fish coming ashore in Venice and areas south. Well, we don't have to go much farther north to have Siesta Key up here, which actually had decent conditions today. You get those onshore winds blowing, and it could bring dead fish and red tide conditions to parts of Sarasota County, maybe even Manatee County as well. And this whole blob of red tide could also drift north a bit as well due to those southwesterly winds pushing this thing to the north. So Manatee and Sarasota counties, you're likely looking at worsening red tide conditions on Thursday and into Friday. And can't rule out an impact in Pinellas County, but right now I think the red tide blob will stay a little bit farther to our south, but we'll keep an eye on it nonetheless for Pinellas County. And after the storm, we're then going to get a cold front that's going to come in with a westerly wind, and that could give us kind of a reinforcing shot of onshore winds, which could continue to make red tide an issue. So that will become a topic after the storm as well. All right, sorry guys, this video went a little bit longer than I intended, but there was a lot of territory to cover. Florida's a big state. Anyway, stay safe. Any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. Otherwise, I'll have another update on your Wednesday with the very latest. And everybody stay safe out there. Okay, have a good night.